Our next episode is one of the most popular episodes of Season 3. It's called Yesterday's Enterprise, and it was episode number 63 of Star Trek The Next Generation, and it originally aired on February 17th, 1990, and it was from a story by Trent Christopher Ganino and Eric Stillwell, and the actual script was written by Ira Steven Behr, Richard Manning, Hans Beimler, and Ronald Moore, and directed by David Carson, who went on to direct the first movie of Star Trek The Next Generation called Star Trek Generations. Now, plot-wise with this episode, it begins rather mildly in 10 forward, with Lieutenant Worf sitting there, and Guinan giving him a sample of prune juice, which Worf declares to be a warrior's drink. And then Guinan and Worf go on to discuss that Worf should have a little more companionship while he's on board, and Worf claims that he would require a Klingon woman for companionship, but Guinan assures him that there would be some women who would even find him tame, so he never knows until he tries. Well, all this is broken up when a strange swirling cloud, which defies description, appears in front of the Enterprise, and Data surmises that it's a temporal rift, which is a rip in the fabric of time. Now, moments later, a crippled ship flies through, and it's the Enterprise, but the NCC 1701C, which was the predecessor of the current Enterprise, the Enterprise D. Now, suddenly, everything about the Enterprise D changes. It's now a ship of war that has been battling in a conflict with the Klingons for the past 20 years. Worf is gone, and Tasha Yar is once again head of security, as you can see in this picture. And Guinan senses this. She's the only one who seems to realize this. And she visits the bridge and knows that the current state of reality is wrong, and spends most of the episode trying to convince Captain Picard of this. Now, just before leaping into the future, the Enterprise C was responding to a distress call from a Klingon outpost. The attacking Romulan ships then turned and fired on the Enterprise C, and basically the fierce volley of photons and phasers created the rip in time and shot the Enterprise C into the future. Now, at the time, the Federation and the Klingons were discussing a peace treaty, and the disappearance of the Enterprise C meant that no Federation ship came to the aid of the Klingon outpost. When the negotiations broke down, no symbolic act stopped the outbreak of war between the Federation and the Klingon Empire. So Picard discusses these matters with the captain of the Enterprise C, and she agrees to go back, to almost certain destruction. But during the first attempt, a Klingon ship attacks, and the captain of the Enterprise C, Rachel Garrett, is killed, which means that Ensign Castillo instead is supposed to lead the Enterprise C in, who has developed an attraction to Tasha Yar. Now, meanwhile, Yar learns that Guinan, in the original timeline, died a meaningless death, which refers to Season 1, episode Skin of Evil. And Yar gets permission to go back with the Enterprise C because she wants her death to count for something. And as soon as the Enterprise C heads back into the rift, everything returns to normal, and we see Guinan once again in 10 forward, this time talking to Geordi LaForge, and she says, "Tell me about Tasha Yar." And that is the end of this episode. A very heavy plot episode, but definitely one that was done very well, and a lot of fans really like. Now, despite this being a really popular episode, there was a lot that went to it, and this was not necessarily a happy time for the writers of the production crew. They had so many episodes to crank through, and there was a lot of tension going on. Now, this particular episode was written under Michael Pillar's new way of getting scripts submitted, in which he allowed non-professionals to submit their ideas, which was unheard of at the time, which I've mentioned before. And Ganino submitted the script, and Eric Stillwell, who was a pre-production associate, turned it in and added his ideas as well. And the original script was a lot different. It ran 106 pages, which is a lot longer than the usual 65 page submission guideline, but a special allowance is apparently made because it was double-spaced, so that went through anyway. And the story involved the Enterprise D's response to a crisis in the Galician sector, and the discovery of the Enterprise C, which had been destroyed 18 years before. Now, the crew of the Enterprise C is in awe of the newer ship's technology, but Captain Picard is facing the dilemma of revealing to their guests their ultimate fate. And the Enterprise C has an ensign who accidentally discovers that the fate of the vessel, and he decides to panic. And Worf and Riker have to capture him after he attempts to escape. Now, while all of this is happening, the Galician warships attack, and Picard defends the Enterprise C using the same maneuver that caused the vessel's destruction in the past. And the ensign is hypnotized, apparently, and returns to the ship, which returns to the past to its certain destruction. So in that version, you really don't see any changes to the Enterprise D, no mention of Yar. All of that was to come. Now, while Ganino and Stillwell were waiting for their script to go through the process of being approved and staying as a potential script idea for an episode, Ganino and Stillwell struck up a friendship, and they began to develop other ideas for other episodes. Now, Gene Roddenberry had distributed a memo that suggested that it would be unlikely to feature Leonard Nimoy as Spock on the series, just because of financial considerations, but he suggested possibly getting Mark Lenard to return as Spock's father, Sarek. So, while this was going on, Stillwell met with Denise Crosby, who played Tasha Yar, as I had mentioned, and she, over dinner, admitted that she missed being on the show, and suggested that Stillwell could write a script to bring her character back, who had been killed off, as I mentioned, in Skin of Evil. So Ganino and Stillwell began to work on script ideas that would involve her return. And originally, the idea was to have a script that would involve both Yar and Sarek. Well, obviously this did not happen, but in the meantime, the original story of yesterday's Enterprise was approved by Melinda Snodgrass, and then was submitted to Michael Piller to be looked at. But at the same time, Ganino and Stillwell, who were actually big fans of the original Star Trek episode Mirror, Mirror, and the City on the Edge of Forever, they wanted to combine elements from that and create an episode in which the Foundation really involved the Vulcans investigating the Guardian of Forever that we saw from the original series. In the past, the founder of modern Vulcan logic was a guy named Surak, and he is killed in this version, which causes massive changes to the timeline, and the Romulans and Vulcans join forces to attack the Federation. And in this version, Worf is no longer a crew member of the Enterprise, and Tasha Yar remains alive. And Sarek and the Vulcans on the surface are the only people not affected by the timeline change, and in the end, Sarek returns to the past to take Surak's place and restore the timeline. So that would have been interesting if they had incorporated Sarek and Yar together with that. And the writers were satisfied with the story, and they decided to pitch that idea to Michael Piller as well. Well, Michael Piller, in the meantime, liked yesterday's Enterprise, and he suggested to Rick Berman that the story, but not the script, be brought to Ganino and be bought from him, and they were going to work with that. But in a meeting, Piller told Ganino that he wanted to make changes to the story, which included the addition of Tasha Yar. Now, he was afraid, Ganino was, that what they considered a better story would be lost if changes to yesterday's Enterprise were undertaken. So Stillwell talked to Piller and pitched their Guardian of Forever story, the one with Sarek and Yar. Now, Piller was intrigued by it, but he felt the Guardian was a gimmick that was from the original series, and really wanted to continue the tradition of the Next Gen standing on its own. So instead, Piller suggested that they actually merge the two stories, and that's what Stillwell and Ganino decided to do. So they created their merging of those stories, and Piller wanted the Enterprise crew to immediately undergo changes due to the presence of the older Enterprise. And he also wanted Guinan to be an integral part of the realization that something was wrong, because they were made aware pretty soon before they were actually going to film it that Whoopi Goldberg was available. So they wanted Guinan to be an integral part of the story. So they created a story based on that, but they were not going to be in charge of writing the actual script. In fact, there were 7 members of the writing staff who actually contributed to the actual script that was written on the page. And according to the rules, as far as credits go, you can only have 3 people listed as writers of an episode. But for this particular one, they got a waiver on that, and they were allowed to include 4. But Michael Piller did not include his name on it, and you just see the 4 that I mentioned at the beginning. So all that to say, lots of changes going on, and you sometimes there's a fear with so many writers being involved in an episode that it's just going to be a disaster. But somehow it turned out really well, and there were lots of changes. Let's go through some of them here. The bridge, of course, looking at this picture, Riker is no longer sitting at Picard's side, he's up on top there. Yar, of course, is a huge change, the way they wanted to bring her back. And also we see, not in this picture, but there are steps leading up to Captain Picard's chair, which has been also elevated. So it's even more throne-like than in the normal timeline. We also see Wesley Crusher, who was made a full ensign and has the traditional red uniform on. You can also see a lot of change in the characters. The Next Gen crew, it's a little darker of interaction and just the way things are going. Riker and Picard are not buddy-buddies in this. You see a lot of anger behind Riker's character. And they didn't really get a chance to flesh that out, but I think they probably would have if they had made it a 2-parter, which originally was the idea, but they did not have the money to do that at the time. It's still a great episode, though, despite that. Other changes, we get to see a lot of bickering between the crew, which you don't see. As I mentioned, the tension between Riker and Picard. Picard says to Riker at one point he doesn't want to hear his opinion. He's just telling them what he wants them to do. We also learn a lot about Guinan's character that we didn't before, and she is somehow, her species is able to tell what happens in 2 alternate universes, and she's the only one who's able to do this, so I find that really interesting. Of course, this episode leads to what happens to Tasha Yar's character in a much more dramatic way of her death, and it leads to the cliffhanger at the end of the 4th season, which I'll talk about later. Other things to talk about here. I really liked the romantic part of this episode too, with Yar and Castillo. I thought the actor for that did really well, and it was interesting because he was also doing a play in the evening, so he was double booked, but you certainly don't see any fatigue there by him in his role. I think the actress who played Rachel Garrett did a great job. You don't see her a lot on screen, but she did a great job as well. And I think it's just really interesting to see just a different look at Star Trek, where they're losing a war. It's kind of negative, and actually the writers had the fun idea of killing everybody off on this alternate universe, with Picard being the only one standing. And really in the final version we just see what happens to poor Riker, but you do see Picard as the last one trying to save the Enterprise at the end, which I think is just awesome. That's not even to mention all the great special effects that are in this episode. We don't see Deanna Troi in the alternate universe because you're not supposed to have a counselor in a time of war. A lot of great things. So comment below things that I have not mentioned or things that you think were really important about yesterday's Enterprise. Thanks for listening, guys.